What is the female elite athlete? According to many historians, the definition for this term is found in the example of when women were first able to compete in the Olympic Games in 1900 Paris, France, for the events of tennis, rowing, and golf, comparable to men's events as well. But looking at it from a modern standing also includes having discussions of societal norms and gender issues that can arise from comparing men's sports to women's sports. Specifically also that as certain issues with LGBTQ representation and related spectrums involving transsexual athletes, as well as in having mental health concerns, can the determination of the elite female athlete become an issue within the industry. Specifically to address the question of what kind of the stigmatized relationship that exists between mental health concerns and physical activity for many female athletes on influencing their performance as a career, we can find that there are three claims in which their routine activity for body development and performance needs are affected by their female physiology. There's a long-term eliteness for career performance that goes against allowing for discussion of depression and anxiety, and that the industry promotes harmful stereotypes that case emotional well-being and body image circumstances into a harmful category. In terms of female physiology, much of this can be attributed to two common reasons. The first being that there's an increased competitiveness within the industry itself. Many female athletes by themselves are having to have a motivation and need or desire to perform better. In order to get the best score possible, you want to be able to achieve the best results, which means achieving the right body demands and such. However, this kind of pressure also increases the risk for potential health results, in which fatigue, stress, and burnout from an overworking symptom-related case can be seen very often, including for motivation then also to keep pushing for these, but not allowing for any actual address to be made on possibly healthily managing these symptoms. Also in the fact that natural processes with blood, musculoskeletal disease, and hormonal levels can be seen also from career performance being favored over everything else, such as in PMS or menstruation and pregnancy status also affecting the way that disease involving blood and muscular growth, as well as proper blood flow, blood hemorrhaging and clotting, and also possible symptoms for cancer-related diagnosis can be seen very often and in a harmful manner. And one of the largest biases seen from the industry itself towards these kind of circumstances is when female athletes are not allowed to be outspoken about issues they may have seeing these. The example of Serena Williams that can be cited is that in post-pregnancy status, she was suffering from very high levels of blood clotting that were impacting the ability for her muscles to properly function. And as a result, she did have to drop out of the event when she was playing, and it decreased her overall rank on the international scale. And also in the case of athletes such as Caster Semenya or Dutee Chand, who are both athletes in the track and field, they have exhibited symptoms of hyperandrogenism, which is the case of higher levels of testosterone comparable to men, rather than the natural levels set for women. The problem with this is that the IAAF, which is the committee that places regulations for female athletes events generally within the Olympics, they have regulations set that limit the ability for regular female athletes to be seen as comparable to these athletes that demonstrate the higher testosterone. Because they exhibit symptoms that are more closer to male athletes, there's a complete bias placed here that limits the ability for these athletes to be seen on the same level, because now there is a discussion of whether or not these athletes can be even considered female in the same category should they be exhibiting more muscular and male symptoms. Continuing from there, there's also mental health. Now, to be noted, mental health is not to be completely defined by depression or anxiety symptoms. There are a lot of other common instances within the industry and in general across female athletes, depending on what event, that have exhibited eating disorders such as anorexia or bulimia, body dysmorphia, and as such, the mention of factors involving overworking such as fatigue, stress, burnout, that also can really be harmful in their performance. But it was found that 33.6% of elite athletes reported symptoms primarily of anxiety, depression. This includes diagnosing themselves and also in potentially seeing a psychiatrist or therapist that diagnose them with such symptoms. And also that in the category of gender, female athletes were seen to suffer at roughly twice the rate of males. And this can be exhibited very clearly by the graph here on the right from a study taken of 465 NCAA Division I athletes, where if the women category for track and field, soccer, and especially the softball and baseball category, women were seen to have more symptoms prevalent than men overall. But with these statistics, the industry has seen that they choose not to address these appropriately and in such stimulate a certain type of idea. The idea that these athletes cannot speak up about any issues they may have in order to better perform and better focus on their career itself. These ideas see that sharing what issues you may have or concerns that they may have is a sign of weakness. It develops an insecurity in many athletes that if they try to speak up about issues they may have, potentially the industry will see them as not being fit to compete properly when they do wish to, or in that peers and such around them will not view them in the same way when performing, because then the focus gets placed rather on the mental health when it should be on both the mental health and the career itself. There isn't just a need to put one emphasis on one over the other. And specifically going to the topic of criticism on female athletes, the two largest that are seen have to do with toxicity from male versus female athletes, and also then to be discussed in body image. For male athletes, there's a higher chance of marketability and preference in the industry, by which they get more screen time and television ratings, and also more stadium and tickets are sold out for their events over female athletes very often. Generally, the view of having so limits the ability for women's participation in elite sports to be seen as an actual desire to compete rather than just for the sake of getting their face on the news. And very often they get placed in that category that if male athletes are being seen more favorable than women's athletes, what reason is there to care about women's athletes as a result? And that's a very harmful way of looking at it that really opens the need to possibly discuss patriarchy and gender gap issues, not just including in the marketability option, but also in possible workplace enforcement and in salary income that can be affected by marketability. And very often the second criticism for female athletes within the industry, no matter what type of sport they play, is in body image. Specifically that in order to be an elite female athlete, there's a need or a constrained desire that they have to have a certain type of high performance body, by which having the right dietary needs and practice routines means that they can meet the specific aesthetics of the sport they're competing in. For example, in gymnastics, rowing, swimming, or even in figure skating, very often a certain type of body image is seen of a leaner and more skinnier aesthetic specifically. Versus if you compare it to soccer, tennis, or weightlifting, upper body strength, more muscular builds are therefore preferred. But this is very harmful because it places the kinds of pressures that mean if female athletes are not naturally meeting these body requirements, such as if you're a plus size female athlete, then the industry is not going to view you as fit to compete in that sport unless you do something to change about it. And very often the methods that can be done can also be very harmful in the long term in developing possible eating disorders such as bulimia and anorexia, which are motivated by that desire to slim down your body figure, or also in having body dysmorphia, by which just simply observing your own body in comparison to others places for the many female athletes that their body, if it doesn't match those of their peers, is not worth any value to the actual sport and to their performance as a career option. But the issue here is that there are female athletes who have spoken otherwise about body change. The industry itself says that being too muscular or too skinny from body change and weight change is a very harmful thing because it makes them look bad, and it means that the female athletes are doing things that are not really healthy for their own bodies. But many female athletes have shared that although they have felt that, yes, their body may not look the same as other athletes in the same category or on the same team even for a certain event, that doesn't mean that having body change is completely a negative. Having a certain development in muscle or strength or stamina helps to improve their performance overall. And having a kind of attitude where they can see it as not just negative, but also with some positives, even with the flaws of it, means that there's also an ability for coaches and other teammates to view it in the same manner, allowing for not just an individual understanding of this, but for a more promoted overall understanding would work to improve the desire of the industry to open up about more athletes who see that they are okay with their body even after it has been fitted to fit a certain aesthetic. So what is a solution to the multitude of issues presented with this? The main solution that was found throughout the occurrence of evidence here was of having on-site available hour specialists in psychiatry and psychology for therapy who athletes can turn to in receiving mental health, meaning that of a 24-hour occurrence, and for the ability for the athletes themselves to go to professionals while they have time both off the field and on the field in between. However, some limitations to this may include a lack of capacity or scheduling opportunities by which the athlete themselves is not able to fit it into their own schedule, or the coach decides that having discussions with a mental health therapist or psychiatrist cannot fit in with the athlete to actually go regularly train and perform, means that then it's not worth it because there has to be more focus on them actually performing. And that goes into another limitation, less time involved in playing. If you're allowing for these specialists to be on site, there's also the possibility it takes away the time from them actually training. And that training is meant to be the most important overall in the industry for them to better perform. So that arises also as an issue with this solution. And in the fact also that this could also be considered to not be applicable to all sporting events. Certain sports over others, such as in contact sports, with that involve soccer or say football, weightlifting and such, more focus is going to be placed on having physical health diagnosis on site, where there's first aid for cases of any concussions that may be seen, or if any problems physically arise while in performance. It's more focused on the physical than on the mental. So that becomes an issue to have a specialist on site when there isn't any actual need supposedly at the time of, more in the present than for long-term circumstance at times. Other solutions that were also found but ultimately do not work as well as the one presented are in having regulations instituted that would include non-discriminatory events for track and field for the cases of both natural testosterone levels in many female athletes and for the hyperandrogenism cases. The problem with this solution is that, unfortunately, that would be a matter of the IAAF themselves, either choosing to go back on their regulations and revise them or to come up with a whole new set. But ultimately, that is not something that I am able to control or an individual besides the overall committee vote would be able to determine. Another solution that is possible, though ultimately has some issues overall, is in having press conferences or releases that would allow more newspaper and media observance of female athletes in between events to actually make comments on body image and claims made against them on the type of body change that they're going through. The problem is that it would be a matter of both coach, marketing team, and in the event committee itself to actually allocate time for this in between events, and also in actually wanting to. There has to be a desire to actually allow female athletes to open up about issues. But in the case of this, very often there will not be. So ultimately, this does not work, even with the positivity it could bring. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, I do have two questions for you. My first question, what evidence did you gather that you didn't use, and why did you not use it?
Some evidence that I did gather that I chose not to use was on the prevalence of transsexual female athletes' participation and them being more outspoken about the kind of discrimination they face in the industry. The reason why I chose not to include it, along with just not in general really placing a large focus on LGBTQ representation for female athletes is because although while it is very valid and very present within the industry, both on the male and female spectrum, it kind of takes away from the focus I wanted to place on female athletics as a whole. Because as much as there are these individual parts to the discussion where female athletes are seen compared to men, compared to other female athletes for not being a certain thing, for being outspoken and such, there's also just an overall arching discussion that I wanted to go into, that female athletes just in general face so much discrimination for being of a certain gender more than anything else in the industry. It doesn't even matter if you include men in the discussion. There's just immediately some issues to be presented. So ultimately, I chose more to focus on the larger that I could with just female athletes than trying to push for individual parts, though very valid still.
All right, and what advice would you have for other researchers who consider this topic?
I would say to them that definitely consider the other options that I chose not to focus on, specifically LGBTQ representation. You could focus on other types of mental health concerns as such with eating disorders. There's a lot more evidence for that you could go into definitely on both female and male athletes. And again, also in transsexuality or more hyperandrogenism cases, because I only focused on like 2 examples, but there have been so many more. And there could be so much more emphasis placed on those things that I didn't do as much of because I just wanted to kind of focus on some things over others. So I would recommend to them definitely look more into those and look at what can be found because there's a lot and you can do a lot in adding to the discussion as a result.